Okay, welcome everyone. We are incredibly excited to start this session on public engagement in AI as part of the Youth and the Future of AI conference. My name is Saif Mullim and I'm going to be the moderator for today. The topic of public engagement in AI has been part of the conversation for a number of years already, but it's evolving, and now it's evolving beyond the space of just raising awareness. Over 36 countries as of October of last year have issued national AI strategies in addition to 6 international AI strategies. And the conversation about public engagement in AI is definitely shifting more and more towards action. So today we have 4 fabulous speakers from very different angles tackling this topic. First, we have Dr. Tina Park, who is the head of inclusive research and design at Partnership on AI. We have also Clara Langevin, I believe, who is the project manager at the Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Brazil. We have Baobao Zhang, who is assistant professor of political science at Syracuse University. And finally, we have Christopher Wilson, who is a visiting researcher at the University of Oslo. Welcome very much, speakers, to the session, and thank you for joining us. We're going to start with a very basic and simple, quote-unquote basic, let's say foundational question. Why is public engagement in AI critical? That's number 1. And number 2, or part 2 of the question, why should the youth care about engaging in AI? So we'll start with Dr. Tina Park. Why is public engagement in AI critical?
Well, thank you so much for getting us kicked off and for moderating the session, and to the organizers for putting this convening together. So, there's so many reasons, but I think first and foremost, so many AI practitioners go into the field because they believe that technology is a tool that can improve people's lives. It's about engaging. And so I think part of that means, like, how do you do that well? And that means having to engage the public and a broad array of people in order to make sure that we're actually able to serve people and meet them with the needs that they have. So for Partnership on AI, meaningful and inclusive engagement of diverse stakeholders is a way to identify and mitigate some of the harms that AI and machine learning systems can have on already disadvantaged and oppressed groups. I think for youth, this is especially important because they do come in, hopefully, with the kind of optimism that they want to make the world a better place. And if you want to do that, you have to really hear from the people who are being affected by it before you can solve their problems. We don't know the intricacies of it, and I think public engagement is a way to get towards that.
Thank you for that. Absolutely, that's why we're all here as youth. We'll move to Clara.
Thank you. I think public engagement in AI is critical because it is a way of building trust. So as Dr. Park mentioned, artificial intelligence is something that can bring that can potentialize a lot of benefits to society, that can increase productivity, allow access to more services, especially within government. But, looking at headlines from the news, we see that there are a lot of risks associated with artificial intelligence. And I got into this field looking at public policy and artificial intelligence because I am somebody who's a little bit more of a Luddite and is concerned about some of the risks that AI can bring to society. So bringing in different groups, different stakeholders, discuss what are these risks and how we can practically mitigate said risks are extremely important to building public trust in artificial intelligence. And I think it's also important to look at the way that we do engage the public. So what are the ways that we can get all those voices in? Is it through conversations on legislation? Is it through public consultations on AI-related projects? Is it through transparency within procurement processes? And also, what stakeholders are we engaging? Are we doing the 4 classics, which is public sector, private sector, civil society, and academia? Or are we trying to get those other groups that don't necessarily have organized voices, such as youth, looking specifically at children and adolescents, who are usually groups that have a lot of access to technologies that use artificial intelligence, looking at iPhones, looking at video games, but don't necessarily have a lot of agency within our society?
Thank you for that. And you brought up a lot of themes. I mean, definitely the words trust and agency stood out for me, among the rest, of course. On that note, we'll move to Christopher.
Who is still learning how to unmute after so long on Zoom. Thanks. Yes, so all of that, absolutely. I think it's especially important in regard to AI and youth because we are in the process of locking down the foundations of governance structures for AI, and these will last at least for decades, however they play out. And, you know, as with so many things, youth will have to live with the poorly understood decisions made by previous generations. And that's not new, but the consequences here are uniquely unclear and potentially really far-reaching. You know, all the ethical frameworks we try to apply to AI, we borrow from other places that aren't structurally or socially or technologically the same. AI it's hard to understand and it's everywhere. Not only are youth using platforms that use AI, not only are there capacity issues to, you know, engaging with it, but often we don't know. It's hidden. And even if we did know, we wouldn't really understand how it works. And so for those reasons, you know, it's what's being set in, maybe not stone, but it's being fixed right now is a kind of, you know, it's a what's behind door number one, or you can choose, well, no, there's only door number one. So engagement is really important because I think it's our best bet for safeguarding the public good as this technology continues to manifest, mature.
Thank you for that. And I think then the phrase, what you don't know can't hurt you, may not actually apply here. Thanks, Chris, for that. And the word foundation really stood out for me. We're laying the foundation now, so now is the time to actually engage with that. And we will close this question with Dr. Zhang.
Thank you for organizing this panel. I want to sort of bring it back to the idea of now we're sort of past the stage of talking about AI ethics, and more governments are considering legislation and regulation of various AI systems. And in democratic societies, we care a lot about accountability to the public, right? And democratic responsiveness. So therefore, when governments talk about trust in AI, it shouldn't just be implementing sort of technical standards, which I think is very important and foundational, but also trust has a very deeply social dimension to it, right? As we've seen in the COVID pandemic, you can make vaccines quite safe, but if the public doesn't trust it, then it won't be adopted. At the same time, public perception might lead to people prematurely adopting AI systems, and we want certainly civil society groups and other actors to inform the public that, hey, this AI system is not safe. Maybe it's discriminatory. Maybe it can cause traffic accidents, et cetera. So I think in terms of democratic accountability, it's really important to consider trust from this social dimension. And in terms of youth engagement, I think this is really critical. We're already seeing narrow AI applications being deployed in schools. In some universities, students are being tracked using cameras that monitor their eye movements. Some of my students, when they go interview for jobs, they're not being interviewed by humans, but by AI systems that can detect emotion, supposedly, or honesty, supposedly. And so these applications, while I don't think AI is inevitable in every field, I do think that it will proliferate through society, and the youth who are growing up and joining the workforce, it's going to have a huge impact on them in the upcoming decades.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting because that very point was also brought up in the FinTech session today. We were talking about how the new generation is entering the workforce. And as you said, they're going to be screened by AI tools. So it's all over us, of course, that's only one application. So that's why it's incredibly important to know how it's shaping the world. And so on that note, as we are talking about public engagement, I think it's good to start with clarifying what we really mean by engagement, because I think there's a lot of words that can be used to describe what we mean by engagement. So I'll start with Dr. Park. You know, the words engagement can be synonymous with participation or sometimes inclusion, but there is a difference between participation and inclusion. Could you clarify what the difference is?
Yeah, and you know, broadly speaking, they're all kind of words that I think oftentimes we end up using interchangeably, and it seems a little bit of a battle of semantics. But you know, at PAI, we really emphasize inclusion and inclusivity as a way to distinguish between practices that meaningfully draw in the public as equal contributors and partners in the discussion, as opposed to those who are just sort of being brought in momentarily. So those kinds of practices that we think about as being very quick, not particularly deep, and not long lasting. So, we're really wary of what Mona Sloan and her co-authors refer to as participant washing, where someone may give the false or misleading impression that a product or service was created with a greater degree of participation and public involvement than actually happened. So for the purposes of our work, we build off of some writings by Catherine Quick and Martha Feldman. So they're urban planners. They come from a very different field, but they have engaged in a lot of public processes around public policy and urban planning. And they distinguish inclusion as a set of practices that really focuses on creating long-lasting communities of practice. So people who come together that aren't just bound by a single issue, but can grow and evolve as those issues and questions change over time. And so, we expand on that definition to really draw attention to the role that power plays and privilege plays in shaping one's capacity to be engaged and to be heard in order to create those longer lasting relationships between participants. I think, in terms of the key difference between, what we think of as just participation versus inclusion is really recognizing what those power differences are, whether it's interpersonal, so between different individuals who are engaged or different organizations, or whether it's systemic, right, rooted in institutions, rooted in systems of power. And so for us, the differences in power really affects who is immediately brought into the conversation versus who is not. Who's being taken seriously as an expert versus whose experiences are sort of being reduced to as being like individual or, very personal perspectives. Who gets to be part of the entire decision-making process versus who's only brought into a little tiny part of it. And, who ultimately gets to have the final say versus, who doesn't even ever find out what the decision actually ever was. All of these things end up making a really big difference as to whether or not they're truly being engaged in the process and being brought in because their feedback, their inclusion really matters in the process. And so really thinking about power forces us to think about who's being excluded and, thinking about exclusion not as a matter of chance or choice, someone, chooses not to be involved with the process, but, it's something that's really structured and systemic and can actually be addressed with a lot of foresight and planning.
Great. It's interesting that really the center of the answer was the words power and power dynamics, which I think is central to getting this right. Thank you for that. And, as we're clarifying semantics, Dr. Zhang, could you also explain to us what public perception means? Because it's also different versus public engagement.
Yes, so I think participatory design is a very critical piece of designing safe and beneficial AI systems. My work and the team of my team at the Center of Governance of AI, what we're trying to do is a bit different. So my team consists of public opinion researchers, and we want to study what the public in various countries, we're mostly focused on the US right now, what they perceive AI to be and what issues matter to them. And we're approaching it at a more macro level, not just focused on a single AI application, but AI in general, but also specific narrow applications of AI. And for us, why we think it's important is because these systems are being deployed quite widely, not just in terms of consumer products that you can buy, but also in terms of public service and what you're being subjected to, say, by employers who are trying to hire employees. So we're sort of thinking about it in a broader context rather than just specific applications when you're designing a system. And the reason why we do so is because we're deeply concerned about how mass politics will shape AI policy going forward. So in my previous chapter of my career, I had been working on climate change public opinion and climate change communication. And there we found it was really important to understand what the US public thought about climate change, because that has an impact on which legislatures they're going to vote for, which candidates they're going to vote for, and which policies they're going to support. And I see moving forward that AI policy will become a part of mass politics, not only in the US, but in other countries.
Thank you for that, and thank you for also clarifying policy versus politics, because I think that's quite powerful. And I think the words that come to mind is the license to operate. I think that's why perception is really important, public perception, because ultimately it's what will offer the license to operate. And on that note, there's a difference between the public sector versus the private sector and how they engage in AI, because I think they really influence separately and in different ways the license to operate. And I know that when we're talking about public and private sector, part of your research, Christopher, was about looking into 16 national strategies for AI, and you've actually done content analysis. And I'm going to read specific couple liners from your research that I want to ask you about. Your research says references to the public's role and public engagement mechanisms are mapped across national strategies, as is the articulation of values related to professionalism, efficiency, service, engagement, and the private sector. Though engagement rhetoric is common, references to specific engagement mechanisms and activities are rare. So there seems to be a gap between the rhetoric and the actual activities to engage the public and the national AI strategies. So out of your research, what would be the, let's say, 3 top takeaways from your study?
Every time. Thanks. Yeah, I think that would be the top line summary, is that in these national strategies, I mapped 16 of them. There was a lot of talk, but not a lot of walk. There was, I think there were 50 references to public engagement, and these were really broadly construed. Any reference to, having a quote unquote democratic process without necessarily saying anything else would have been counted. So there was a lot of, it was quite generous in mapping references to engagement. But still, those only showed up in 11 countries. And out of those, only 6 of those 50 references were referring to some kind of specific policy. And even those policies or processes were not very well elaborated. And so you'd have things like the Finland national strategy, which, Finland tends to be relatively good on this stuff. They had this fantastic sentence. It was something like, "We will manage these risks by public engagement to enable the required legislation." And so maybe this is just magical thinking on the part of governments, that we can add the special sauce of public engagement and that will fix these problems. It might be that. Maybe it's because public engagement is actually quite hard. We know that it's costly. We know that public administrators and civil servants are often afraid of it, and they think it's going to make their work more difficult. And in some ways, sometimes it does. And so I guess an optimist reading these results might say that, well, at least there's rhetoric. Rhetoric might be the first step. Maybe we are building a culture for public engagement in the way governments think about AI governance. I'm skeptical to that because of what we've seen in other aspects of human rights and technology and participatory government and such. And I think that Tina, you referenced a lot of different ways of doing engagement, and it reminded me that we've been doing as a community, we've been doing some kind of e-participation for like 20 years. We've learned a lot. And I made a fine point in the opening to talk about how different AI is in terms of the harms it can do and how little we know and how ubiquitous it is. But in terms of power, I really think this is the same stuff. There are power relationships, and there's insiders and there's outsiders. And it's all about being smart in how you design it, how you embed values, how you get people at the table, and particularly youth, people who aren't otherwise necessarily engaged in politics per se, and we should know how to do this. So the fact that governments are talking a little bit about it, but not really planning to do anything, I think is actually cause for concern. Another thing, and I'll wrap quick here, but another thing I found in the analysis is that when it does get referenced, it's referenced almost always in direct connection to private sector values of creating market value or efficiency. And there's lots of evidence that when governments or ministries or departments or individual civil service teams, when they get excited about AI, often it's because they have this idea that it's going to make their work easier. And so we see things like, national welfare services embracing AI programs to process applications for them, right? And there's huge excitement about all the time this is going to save, because just like every NGO or every academic, every government worker is overworked. There's not enough hours in the day. There's too much to do. It's the idea that technology is going to do it for them is hugely attractive. But what that does is this analysis suggests it's opening up the door for the governance regimes to be designed in the first instance by private sector interests. And to my mind, that's something that it should not at least be a blind choice. It should not be a default, which is where we're at now. And we need public engagement to try and safeguard that a little bit and think more critically about it. So those are the insights and the implications, I think, of what I found, which is, yeah, it's basically a lot of talk, not a lot of walk in terms of engagement.
Thanks for that, Chris. And I definitely have a follow-up question that I'm going to come back to. Because we're entering private sector voice or way of thinking in national AI strategies, or at least that the analysis, as you've seen, my question that I will ask in a little bit, not now, sort of then which voices should we center? But you talked about public agencies and public work, which I think is a great segue to the question that I'm going to ask Clara. Clara, with your project in public procurement and AI, so public procurement in AI is one of the great ways to straddle the balance between public and private collaboration on AI, because it inherently engages both. So could you tell us more about the project that you've done with the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Brazil? And perhaps you can elaborate more on how civic society has played a role in public engagement in AI in Brazil.
Of course. So our center in Brazil, we are adapting the World Economic Forum's AI procurement in a box guidelines, which was published in 2020 and I think piloted by the United Kingdom and other countries. But basically our task to do with Brazil was to adapt these guidelines, which have been successful around the world, to the Brazilian context, looking at specifically some of our challenges, such as a more complicated procurement process, looking at the role that Brazil plays, particularly government agencies as normally importers of technology, and some of the other ethical concerns, such as the fact that Brazil has very large vulnerable populations. So we started this project at a very delicate time in conversations about AI governance. When we started it, the Brazilian national AI strategy had just been published, which did put in some ideas on how oversight in the public sector should happen with AI governance, and also new updates to our procurement legislation that allowed for more dynamic innovation procurement procedures. So we kind of were at this intersection. We could have relevant conversations both on innovation procurement and AI governance, particularly in the public sector. So we started this project piloting both at the Metrô de São Paulo, which is one of the largest subway systems in the world, and the Hospital das Clínicas, or the Clinical Hospital of the University of São Paulo, which is one of the largest public research hospitals in the global south. And basically, we looked at how these organizations were prepared institutionally to mitigate potential harms that could arise from using artificial intelligence systems. We looked at how they could bring more transparency within their procurement process, such as publishing algorithmic impact assessments along with a request for proposals, and other ideas on how they can be more forefront both with society at large and their potential suppliers to make sure that the risks involved with using different systems in different contexts were shared. And also looking at the types of data that they were going to use to either train these models or retrain these models and test these models to make sure that these were systems that made sense for the context and for the population which they were going to be used. And so through this, we also engaged different members of society. So we made a steering committee of specialists, both from the private sector, the public sector, obviously from both state and federal government, and civil society, as well as academia, both on the side that produces these technologies, because the groups that create artificial intelligence in Brazil mostly come from academia and not necessarily from the private sector, as well as civil society. And so we were able to create our own toolkit based on the World Economic Forum's guidelines that looked at specific contexts in Brazil that made sense for the implementation of these guidelines. And we opened up our project to a public consultation, which actually just ended last Friday, to make sure that even those entities that we didn't consult directly through our network of specialists were able to discuss what were their main concerns on the use of artificial intelligence in the public sector. And so we'll be publishing this guideline in Portuguese, or this toolkit in Portuguese, on March 24th of this year. And we hope that this work will also feed into the global AI procurement in a box project. So we hope to bring more ideas on how to implement AI procurement, but also how to better engage communities, and also how to create public trust, perhaps looking at directly on how risk can be discussed throughout the procurement process, both with the supplier and the community at large. And then as for your question on how to engage civil society on public engagement, Brazil has a very rich history on incorporating the viewpoints of civil society within our tech policy legislation. So a huge example was in 2014, the Marco Legal da Internet, which is the Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights, which was basically a 7-year process that was led by the civil society, looking specifically at the Institute for Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro. And this kind of set the blueprint of how civil society would engage with public policy at large, particularly in technology in Brazil. So this was something that was copied both with the General Data Protection Law, the National Plan for IoT, and even the current Brazilian national strategy. And so there is this importance of bringing civil society to the forefront. Now, if that civil society, because civil society is such a huge word, right? It could be business association, it could mean technology related organizations, but it could also mean groups that represent vulnerable communities. So in order to make sure that all that different here, that different fan of civil society is represented within the policy building process, is something that's really important for Brazil, and something that I hope we can continue in the future.
Thank you for that, Clara. And as you were saying, I was thinking about all the ways, as you were answering the question, I was thinking about all the ways that you mentioned the public was engaged. So public consultations was one of them. Were there any other ones that either were already deployed, sort of methods for public engagement that were deployed in the past, or ones that you plan on deploying in the future, other than public consultations?
Public consultations are a big thing in Brazil with most different types of public policies. And it'd be interesting to see if that is a way that is an effective way of engaging society. We have worked with some focus groups to see feedback on at least our project with AI procurement, but it is something that we hope to see more in the future. So for example, the Brazilian AI strategy has created a governance group to sort of take some of the ideas that were published in the version in April and sit them down for implementation with specific indicators and suggestions on how resources should be allocated. And that was a group that was created by the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation, and does include several different organizations. So obviously private sector companies, different members of the public sector, but also academic research institutes and some civil society organizations. So that is one model on how to increase that public engagement. But then again, it's always that question, is it the most effective way of engaging the public?
Yeah, got it. And is it representative of what the public wants to actually happen? Makes sense. Thanks, Clara. And on that note, you're based in Brazil. Right now I'm based in Jordan. I know that Chris is in Europe. We have the fellow speakers in the US. So we definitely have folks from around the world. And as we're speaking about civic society and different populations, I know that Dr. Park, we spoke about a piece by the co-founder of the Montreal AI Ethics Institute that came out in MIT Tech Review in 2020 that has the title, AI Ethics Groups Are Repeating One of Society's Classic Mistakes. Too many councils and advisory boards still consist mostly of people based in Europe or the United States. So I wanted to ask you, how can we, because I know that at PA you guys are really focused on that in partnership on AI, how can we, in a globally connected world, leverage this connection that we have to engage users from around the world and help create appropriate standards to govern these systems in each jurisdiction? How can we make sure that each population is getting the care that they deserve?
I want to think about this in two different ways. One is, if we're serious about disrupting these kinds of colonial patterns, because that's what we're seeing happen right now, we're seeing very old systems of power at play. We need to stop presuming that, they, as in like leaders from underrepresented regions, need to always come into Western oriented spaces. They themselves have already created spaces for knowledge production, for decision making, for public engagement. And those spaces should be recognized and respected as equally prestigious and relevant initiatives as the ones that are being created in Europe and the US. I think we need to understand needs and priorities are bound to be different across different regions. And so these initiatives that are centered in places like the Middle East, Africa, or Latin America should have access to funding and material support to activate and sustain these endeavors that meet those needs and priorities first and foremost. Because at times those needs are going to be in conflict with what, say, the US or Western Europe wants to focus on, and we have to find that balance. This all being said, I'm not in any way advocating that we also shouldn't be actively seeking inclusion into these European or US-led spaces. At Partnership on AI, we do think about this a lot because we do consider ourselves a global network of stakeholders. And we've had to have a really hard look at how we do our own work because, as the staff, we're mostly based in the US. We do have some Canadian staff members. We try to think about diversity, but we have that limitation. Many of our organizations and partner organizations are based in Europe or the US. And we found, there are really simple barriers that we can deal with. Like we've been bad about time zones. We've always centered things on the US time zone, and that's deeply problematic. We should not be expecting our global partners to be staying up into crazy hours of the night to be part of the conversations with us. We also have a major barrier, which is language. We primarily conduct all of our convenings in English. And we have that expectation that that should be the language of comfort for everyone. And so I think those are two things that we need to really be thoughtful about in terms of how are we adapting ourselves so that we can actually meet folks where they are, whether that's the time zone, whether that's the language. I think we're also really thinking about, how do we support partners who are already based in and doing work in parts of the world that we want to be more engaged in, rather than trying to start new initiatives that we're in areas that we're unfamiliar with. And, building those partnerships, we've started the conversation by talking about trust. It means trusting that they've put in the work and the time to figure out what those needs are and really having them lead the way rather than us as an organization dictating what the work needs to look like or what the priorities need to be. So being really in that sort of student role, learning from the leadership that we have on the ground in these areas. And something that I'm always encouraging others to think about is, what are the criteria that we're really using to determine expertise or relevance? And how are those, again, criteria being skewed by our own privilege and position of power within these ecosystems? Are we delegitimizing someone's expertise and experience because, maybe they didn't complete their training at a prestigious institution in the US or Europe? Like, how are we taking seriously the kinds of educations that people are receiving overseas outside of the US and Europe? And I would say, one of the things that we really need to think about is, people don't fit neatly into some of the categories that we have around, like, are they a citizen? Are they a resident? Are they a user or a procurer of a particular product? And we need to really start to blur some of those lines and think about, how different forms of public participation across a lot of different sectors need to come together simultaneously so that no one's left out. And I think about young people really specifically are caught in that crossroads. So like, young people are often, they're not seen as customers because it's assumed that some adult in their life is the one who actually physically purchased access to an AI or machine learning enabled product. They're not necessarily seen as citizens or residents or relevant ones because they don't vote or can't vote yet in elections. So they're often ignored by policymakers. And there's this weird expectation that, parents or guardians or other adults are going to be speaking on their behalf. And I think, again, we have to really problematize that idea that somebody else can speak for someone else's needs better than others, right? And I think that's a core idea that we need to carry through if we're trying to really do this kind of engaged work across the globe, that people who experience it themselves need to have the platform to speak for themselves.
Thank you for that, Dr. Park. And it definitely made me think about, just putting this conference together. Literally last night, I was chatting with the team and I told them we have the time zones as North American and European because we have 2 periods for the schedule. And I said, can we rename them to Eastern Hemisphere and Western Hemisphere? So just plainly geographic. So that way, it's not, we're not centering, again, whose voices are we centering essentially? So on that note, actually, as we are bringing global populations together, we had the very first session today on AI and the future of peace, and we even had a speaker from Stop Killer Robots. And so, Dr. Zhang, I have a question for you about the role of civic society. What has been the role or the impact played by civic society organizations on addressing the public concerns regarding these hot topics, right, of autonomous weapons or facial recognition? So what role has the public played so far, and particularly, again, what role can the youth play in those conversations?
That's a really good question. I think, at least in the US, civil society groups have really played an important part in terms of stopping or bringing attention to various harmful uses of AI. So recently we have heard of this case where ID.me, which is a facial recognition identification company, was contracted by the IRS to verify tax submissions. If you're going to file your taxes online, you would need to be verified using this facial recognition system. And we saw that a lot of the civil society groups like Fight for the Future and the Algorithmic Justice League and AI Now and all these civil society organizations coming out with statements saying, no, this is harmful because we know that facial recognition systems don't work as well for people of color, for women. So there are going to be people who can't file their taxes. And also in terms of contracting out to this private company, what's going to happen to the data, right? The data might not be protected, and then you're putting people's data at risk. And given how you can't really change your face, it's a permanent identifier, and there's all sorts of risks involved, and IRS was then backtracked. So we saw that civil society groups stepped in when these emergencies happen, and in many cases were able to make an impact. And I think that's good that there is this stopgap. Also, I like to credit journalists who bring attention to these problematic uses of AI. I'm hoping to move that we'll be able to move to a point where we might have actually a legal framework to prevent these harmful uses to happen in the first place, rather than be in this reactive mode where something bad happens and then civil society groups must react to it. Speaking of civil society groups and youth activism, one example that I like to point out is young people, when they're being threatened in some way by policies that's trying to implement a harmful AI system or autonomous system, they've been vocal about it. In the UK, we've seen that there was this algorithm that was going to determine students' grades, which impacts undergraduate admissions. And that system, it's not AI exactly, but it uses an algorithm and it discriminates against students who go to under-resourced state-run schools. And students were deeply upset by this, and a lot of them participated in protests, and the UK government had to backtrack. So again, I see these examples where there is a problem and young people have participated by protesting or by raising awareness to say, hey, we got to stop this. So I'm a bit hopeful, but I would like to see that we actually have some legal framework to prevent the bad stuff from happening in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zhang, and that resonates with me a lot because yesterday I was part of a policy fellowship session, and that was the point that we were discussing, right? How can we be more on the offense as opposed to always being on the defense? So that resonates a lot, and I gotta thank you because in your answer you talked about sort of with the IRS example, how can we guide public sector decision making, which was the perfect setup for my next question to Chris, so thank you for that. Chris, you've co-authored Sustainable AI, which is, as you mentioned, an integrated model to guide public sector decision-making. So can you clarify to us, what do you mean by sustainable AI, and how does it play a role in the public sector?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's such a fascinating conversation. There's so many threads to follow up on. It's hard to stay focused, but so that article was motivated by the fact that we're seeing the term sustainable AI pop up a lot of places. There's research centers, there's think tanks, but nobody quite seems to mean the same thing. At the same time, a lot of the recommendations that are being made to governments and others about how to make AI be less bad have to do with things like ethics. And though I recognize, wanting to think that we're beyond ethics and we're moving towards regulation, a lot of that is still really, grounded in thinking about what is ethical AI. And the problem is that ethics are really slippery. They're hard to define. They mean different things to different people. They're easy to, ethics wash or open wash. We've seen the failure of so many ethical committees of, elite capture and interest capture. And so this article was motivated by an interest in seeing whether or not sustainable AI could actually be defined as something operational, because it comes from sustainable development, which is linked to the SDGs, which has been operational for a long time now. They've been rolling out programs and targets and indicators. I mean, this is really, really operational stuff. So the idea was to see if we could, apply that to AI. And we came up with a model to do so, looking at social sustainability that really revolves around what are the red lines you can't cross. And there's 5 of them that have to do, with not messing up society's capacity to know what's going on, society's capacity to, engage, and seek redress when things go wrong, don't denigrate trust. So there's a number of red lines and boundaries that are respected. And so this is a framework for government workers when they're either, developing regulation, or when they're, adopting AI for public services and such, to think about what are the things, what are the no-go zones, and how do I find them, how do I respect them, and what are the tools I can use. And so it's kind of that middle ground between abstract ethics and real concrete approaches like Clara was describing. But in listening to the last 2 answers to questions, I do wonder if maybe this is I wonder if we who are so interested in public engagement are not in danger of not thinking enough about the build it and they will come fallacy. Because everybody, governments and companies all care about public perception, and we can make lots of arguments, and we've got lots of we've got a wealth of experience to draw on for, how to get people to the right table and how to frame things differently and how to go where people already are. But, we've seen time and time again that, the hardest thing at the end of the day is often just getting people to care. And so maybe we should not only be more proactive in, not just relying on civil society watchdogs, but maybe we should also be more proactive in making arguments, and especially to youth, about why this matters. Because Bao, you mentioned the example of student grades, and of course students are going to get up in arms about student grades, but it's less obvious that they're going to care about, the way that AI is being used to make zoning decisions, or to to set up chatbots to manage caseworking, or all of this really weird anodyne bureaucratic stuff that has important consequences. I don't know if we've necessarily made a great case for why people should engage once we've set the table for them. And so I don't know, I'd love to hear others' thoughts on that.
Absolutely. And Dr. Zhang, I think you have something to add. Please go ahead.
Sure, Chris, I think you made a great point that we need to get more people to care. And one of the things that my team has been studying is whether people perceive certain AI applications as AI at all. And I think this is where there's a gap between people's knowledge and what experts know. In many cases, because the AI is sort of embedded into other existing pieces of technology, we found in our survey that was published in 2019 in the report, we found that a lot of people don't necessarily think, say, smart speakers are AI, or that the Google search engine uses AI. And I think this is where what I'm trying to do in terms of as a teacher is to educate my students about AI applications in everyday life and get them to see how AI is being deployed in their daily lives. So I think in terms of education, it shouldn't just happen at the undergraduate level or the graduate level where I teach, but also much earlier on in primary or secondary school, given how ubiquitous the technology has become.
I think that's great to say, actually, because we have William in the chat saying, this is an interesting conversation and thinking how I can apply what's being presented to my STEAM, or I believe maybe STEM classes at my middle class, and with my Web 2.0 and Web 3.0 digital media that I teach on the college level. My audiences are from Black, Hispanic, South American, Central American, and African. We have a diverse audience of students, and all their voices should be heard. Yeah, again, there's a lot of threads to pull, but I have to end, I mean, with the panel discussion specifically talking about data. And we just got out of a session centering the topic of data colonialism. So I'll ask Clara, actually, since, you know, I think the public engagement conversation is getting to a point, meaning collectively, towards action and not just awareness. Could you share with us some of what you shared with me about Brazil being an importing or exporting country and what that means for data?
I think so. Brazil is a country that mostly imports artificial intelligence technologies. Yes, there's startups, there's academia that are developing AI models, but most of the systems that are used in Brazil are imported from abroad. And so that gets into the conversation about data colonialism and about ethical considerations that are sometimes discussed in the global north, but don't necessarily match with some of the issues and risks that we have in the global south. So if you see a lot of these AI models, like look specifically at the healthcare sector, they might be trained on data that's relevant to Europe or relevant to the United States. So for example, an algorithm that can detect skin cancer. An algorithm that can detect skin cancer that was trained on data from Europe is not going to be as accurate for detecting skin cancer on, say, Brazilian skin tones. And so that's something that is a major concern for a lot of, especially public sector and public healthcare sector AI users. So how do we ensure that this technology is accurate when we use it in our countries? And especially since, you know, a false diagnosis can have major impacts on the lives of individuals. And so something that, particularly with our pilot in the Hospital das Clínicas, the clinical hospital of the University of São Paulo, one of their major aspirations is to become a hub that will retrain a lot of these algorithms that were brought from abroad to ensure that they're relevant and adequate for use with the Brazilian public, and then allocate them out to different healthcare systems within Brazil. So that's something that is extremely important. And it's something that when we talk about, you know, the place of the importing nation and the importance of looking critically on what kind of data that we use to train and test, and of course, retrain these algorithms, is something that I see missing from a lot of conversations about ethical AI. And I think it's one of those things that we need to talk about if we want to get specifically into implementing what we mean by the ethical use of AI in our society. And I think sometimes this, you know, reframing as looking at risk and looking at actionable goals instead of high-level ethical principles, which I think we have like more than 86 different sets of AI principles. So that's one of the things that, at least in Brazil, we see as extremely important.
Thank you for that, Clara. And I want to go back to the point of reframing at the end of this conversation. But before, I'm going to share a question from the audience. So Lornie Pfeiffer, hi Lornie, she asked the question, how can we ensure that when AI systems are designed, that diverse demographics are included? Example, I've heard that the 5 biggest American companies hire focus groups of young people to give product feedback. But how do we make sure that these types of groups aren't comprised specifically of groups from tech ecosystems? And I remember I spoke to Lorna about this. So, you know, what we have heard is that essentially those focus groups are pulled in from people who are already within those circles. So how do we do that? And I'm already seeing hands being raised. So I'll start with Dr. Zhang and then I'll move to Dr. Park. Go ahead, Dr. Zhang.
I think that's a great question, Lornie. One thing that I have to add is I think we need to value the expertise of those who are working in the social sciences, who think a lot about representativeness and think about how people from different demographic groups would impact, say, labeling data, for instance. When I was working at the Pew Research Center, one of the challenges we faced when we were labeling, asking people to label text data, tweets in this case, was that people of different political backgrounds, people of different races, and even genders have very different reactions to tweets. For instance, some might perceive this tweet to be threatening, others might perceive it to be, not as threatening. And that has a big impact in terms of if we were going to commercialize our ML system, it will have a big impact. And in just doing this social science academic exercise, we learned a lot. And I think having experts who are trained to understand how various demographic attributes, but also people's lived experiences impact how they might interact with the AI system, or even, at the stage of training the AI system by labeling data, that's really critical. And I think too many tech companies fall short in terms of hiring people with that social science expertise.
I'm trained as a sociologist, so I'm like, yes, Dr. Zhang, absolutely. There's a wealth of expertise and knowledge out there about these things. I also think, Chris started us off earlier by talking about, how vague some of these standards are around public engagement. And part of that has to do with the fact that it's really hard. It takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of time, and it's complicated. And I think especially for our industry partners, they have to recognize that there isn't an efficient way to do this. Like there's not an efficient and fast and easy way to build trust, especially with communities that have genuinely been harmed by this technology in the past, that have really historically problematic relationships with profit generating companies who have used, their bodies, used their knowledge in problematic ways. And so we just sort of have to start from, first of all, this is going to take time, it's going to take energy, you need more expertise, you need more skill sets in terms of how to engage with these communities, how to speak in ways that are understandable and legible, how to actually build longer lasting trust and inroads into these communities, how to actually give something back that's meaningful to these communities who do get engaged, because oftentimes, again, we think we can write a check and compensate them for their time and that's it, when in fact, more often than not, communities want something much deeper, much greater than that. And so I think we need to start there and slow down some of these processes, because I think we're in such a push, especially on the industry side, to move and build products and get them out as quickly as possible, that more often than not, practitioners see this public engagement component as a major roadblock and a major bottleneck, instead of as an incredible point and an asset that could help them problem solve for future issues, just the same way that we would red team, security issues or privacy issues. We need to be seeing these communities as part of the solution to these problems rather than that sort of bottlenecking. So I would say, put more money towards these efforts, actually hire the people who have the skill sets to be able to do it, build meaningful relationships with communities, and really hear from them in terms of what they need before demanding that they give all their insights, into making a product better at the end of the day.
Right. Hashtag show us the money. Thanks, Dr. Park. Okay, we'll move to Christopher.
Yeah, that's all so great to hear. It's so right on, but it is hard, right? And another thing is that it is almost categorically harder the farther away those voices are from the discourse that's already in place, right? It becomes more costly and more difficult. We also have to be, sober and clear about the investments that are required to achieve the benefits that you were describing. But I would just like, in my last minute, I would just like to suggest that we should also be skeptical about trust. Right? Trust isn't always a good thing, because it can often be trust in me to do bad things. And so the rhetoric of trust is really exploding right now, And there's lots of initiatives to build trustworthy AI. But I think that we need to invest a lot of time and attention into thinking about what trustworthy really is, and talking about deserved trust instead of just supporting efforts towards trust, which I think we're often inclined to do.
Thank you for that, Chris. And Clara, will move to you.
I was just, this conversation, looking at the AI procurement in a box project, one of the guidelines that got the most noise from our community was the 7th guideline, which talks about how both the private sector groups that are going to be managing the AI project and the suppliers have to have employees that are both diverse in terms of social demographics and in terms of discipline. And that was something that everybody was like, oh, but it's so difficult for us to do that in the public sector, in the private sector. How are we going to do that? And so some of the things we actually had to walk through on how you can do this within the Brazilian public sector. There are pools of different applicants that can be used. Brazil also has several, which I think is similar to a lot of different countries looking at the US too, has like programs of teaching kids, teaching youth, teaching people from marginalized communities how to program and how to engage with these different technologies. So that's something that's extremely important. And then looking at Chris's conversation on trust, and if having trust is a good thing overall, and how we can kind of get complacent on how we build public trust. I can always see, like, something I can imagine is like, okay, we create a certification, and then an AI developer will have this like certification and they'll be good to go. And then we won't really think about how do we build in these sorts of monitoring and checkpoints to make sure that a system is going well throughout its life cycle, because that's one of the big issues. AI models, they change depending on the inputs. It might start out as something that is risk-free and is doing really well, but it might have some sort of concept drift within like 2 or 3 or 5 years that completely changes something and maybe create some sort of harm to society.
Thank you for that, Clara. And I know that we have 2 or 3 minutes to go. So, I mean, here's what I will end with. This topic is very dear to my heart. It started from a project that I did with the Montreal Hub at the Global Shapers, where we worked with Statistics Canada to survey Montrealers about what they think and feel about AI. You know, if I were to sort of use a quote that summarizes the ethos of that project, it was by Alice Walker, the author of The Color Purple. She said, I'm paraphrasing, she said, the most common way by which people give away their power is by thinking that they don't have any. So, you know, I mean, why should we care about public engagement in AI is because you are definitely affected by it in one way or another, and it's going to always go back to power. And going back to you know, public policy, you either have the money or you have the power of the people and the numbers. And you know, I think it's about time that the people come together when it comes to AI. Well, I want to thank our speakers. This has been incredibly interesting. Honestly, I could have pulled on each thread for the entire hour, hoping that it was informative, fun, engaging, and did it justice. So thank you for everyone for joining us, the speakers for this session. I'm going to drop in the chat a link for a questionnaire where you can enter your answers for a question that we're including in the AI Youth Manifesto about how the youth can engage in AI. And the climate session is going to start in 30 minutes from now, but until then, please feel free to stay on the line as we network. So thank you, speakers, and wish everyone a great day ahead.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.